Okay, it's recording. So I would like just to present briefly Roman DiBiase. So Roman has done his bachelor at UC Berkeley and then his PhD at Arizona State University that he got in 2011. So the same year we got our PhDs. It's a small time. Then he did a postdoc until 2014 at Caltech and then moved to Penn State University, first as an assistant professor and since 2020 as a Rudy Slingerland early career professor. And he's working on many different things, but mainly on quantifying erosion processes and sediment transport with many different applications, such as post-wildfire erosion, landscape evolution, and combining different tools. And today we'll talk us about morphodynamics of mixed soil-mantled and bare bedrock hill slopes. So please, Roman, welcome, and we are very happy to listen to your presentation and results.
All right. Well, thanks, Pierre, and thanks to Boris and Steffi also for the invitation to come talk today. And thanks for everyone who's logging in here. Hopefully you're able to figure out the time zone difference if you're in the US and trying to figure out daylight savings time. So this is the work I'm going to talk about today is going to be focused on thinking about how we understand how the landscapes that are a mix of soil mantle and bare bedrock hill slopes work, like the background image here that shows sort of a merge of a photograph and a LiDAR hillshade topography that's colorized by slopes steeper than 45 degrees that generally correlate with areas of rock exposure. This is work that's been funded by the National Science Foundation in the Geomorphology and Land Use Dynamics program. And a lot of the data I'll show today is sort of the analysis couldn't really be done without the help of NCOM, the National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping, collecting airborne LiDAR data. And so the work I'm going to be showing today is a collaborative effort, and I've shown those collaborators here, but one in particular I just want to highlight. A lot of the first half of the talk is going to be work that came from Al Neely's PhD. So he just finished up at Penn State and is now a postdoc at UCLA. And there's a picture of him there on the right. And so I'm going to be talking about hill slopes today, and we're interested in hill slopes as geomorphologists because most of the landscape is made of hill slopes. So you look at the image here, and most of what you see is a hill slope. These are key sites for weathering and sort of converting rock to sediment. And then that sediment is delivered into river networks, and the amount and size of sediment delivered into river networks controls how steep those rivers are and controls the relief of the landscape indirectly through that connection. And then on top of that is people. So you can see houses along the front of the mountain range here in the San Gabriel Mountains. This is sort of just north of Los Angeles. We're also really interested in landslide hazards. So understanding how sediment gets off of hill slopes is important for thinking about sedimentation hazards. So most of the framework that we have for thinking about hill slopes has been developed for soil mantled landscapes, like the one on the top here from the Carrizo Plain in California. And we have a really well calibrated framework for how soil mantled hill slopes evolve. In that we have rules that can describe how sediment moves on hill slopes as a function of topography or soil thickness. We can understand, how soil is produced from rock as a function of how thick the soil mantle is, and we can pull these pieces together into models for how landscapes change in soil mantled systems. So this is just a couple figures here on the bottom from a paper by Taylor Perrone, just showing a simple hill slope evolution. As you increase uplift rate, the morphology of the hill slopes that results from that. So we can take those models and we can connect them to the real world. So this is an example from Josh Roaring's work looking at Gabilan Mesa in California and the Oregon Coast Range. And we can extract metrics of topography from these landscapes and connect these soil mantle landscapes to theory And we can do a pretty good job of connecting models to theory for soil-mantled landscapes. And I was looking through the Landscapes Live, the program coming up here. And I guess I just wanted to also highlight, as after I made these slides, it sounds like maybe next week we're going to find out more from Simon Mudd that actually we don't understand soil-mantled landscapes or any hill slopes in general. So this will be interesting to kind of get another perspective on that. But in general, I would say we understand soil-mantled landscapes, or we have a conceptual framework for soil-mantled landscapes that is sort of mature and well-developed. When we move to thinking about landscapes where bedrock starts poking through the surface, it becomes trickier to pull together a framework for how we predict erosion and sediment transport in landscapes that are a mix of soil and bare bedrock, like this one in the San Gabriel Mountains that I'm showing in the picture. And some of the key challenges that this adds when you have bedrock poking through the surface is that now we need to explicitly understand the weathering and soil production from rock. So how do you convert from rock to soil? What happens when you expose rock at the surface? And then on top of that, because soil and rock have different properties, they have different strength. We can't just treat the landscape as like a single threshold. So we can't pick a single threshold to describe the behavior of the landscape. And I'll go more into that in detail a little bit later. And then the third point here is that when you get to slopes that are, in particular, when they get steeper than the angle of repose, you have sediment when it moves on it travels long distances, and so you can have individual motion of grains that transports the whole distance of the hill slope, and this sort of violates some of the continuum assumptions that we typically use for thinking about soil-mantled hill slopes. And then I just have a sort of asterisk here for when I'm talking about soil throughout this talk. I'm going to use a pretty simplistic definition, and that I'm going to assume soil is everything that is not in place bedrock on these landscapes. And so we're really thinking about the difference between stuff that's in place and stuff that's been broken down and mobilized. So for this talk, it's going to have two parts to it. The first part is going to be thinking about how we can use landscapes that are a patchwork of soil and bare bedrock to understand how bedrock fracturing controls erodibility. And this is going to focus on the long-term landscape evolution side of things. We're going to quantify contrast in bedrock fracture density from exposed rock in the landscape, measure erosion rates and soil production from beryllium-10 in sediment, look at the extent and morphology of bedrock cliffs, look at the morphology and texture of the soil-mantled parts of those landscapes, and then I'll talk briefly about the impact on sediment grain size that results from this. And then for the second part of the talk, we're going to take the same landscape, but now look at it in the context of short-term disturbance and hazards. And here we're going to be looking at what are the consequences of a shift from soil to bedrock that happens in time. So we go from landscapes that were formerly soil-mantled, and that following fire, that sediment makes it into the channels sort of immediately through a process called dry rabble. And then we're going to quantify the dry sediment loading of channels following these fires and try to connect these to our existing models of how to deal with post-fire debris flows and make the connection between hill slope processes and post-fire debris flows. Okay, so for the first part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about how bedrock fracturing influences landscape erodibility. And in particular, we're interested in direct impacts, like the role of fractures in controlling the strength of bedrock hill slopes, and then how efficiently we can convert rock to soil, which controls the partitioning of soil versus bedrock on hill slopes. And then there's also the indirect impact of the size of sediment that gets produced off of these hill slopes and the implications of that for the sediment that is sitting on hill slopes and in channels. So the goal here is to quantify this bedrock fracturing at the landscape scale, quantify these processes above at the landscape scale, and connect them into a process-based framework. We're going to use, to do this, we use high resolution imagery, sort of 1 to 10 centimeter imagery, airborne LiDAR topography, and catchment erosion rates from beryllium-10. So the study area that I'll be talking about today is in Southern California. So the star here is Southern California. This is Los Angeles here on the left. And we're going to be looking at 2 landscapes in Southern California, the eastern San Gabriel Mountains here on the left, and the northern San Jacinto Mountains on the right. And these 2 landscapes have similar climate and vegetation. They're similar granitic lithology, and they're both steep landscapes that have a patchwork of soil and bare bedrock hill slopes. And throughout this part of the talk, I'm going to use sort of a color code here of blue and red to correspond to the San Gabriel Mountains and the San Jacinto Mountains. So the primary contrast between these 2 landscapes is the degree of bedrock fracturing that you can see in the exposed outcrops in the landscape. And so on the left is a picture of a cliff in the eastern San Gabriel Mountains. The rock is highly shattered, right? So you have high fracture density in this cliff, and the morphology of that cliff is differs as well. On the right is a cliff example from the northern San Jacinto Mountains, where the fracture density is much lower. And so first we need to quantify this difference in fracture density, and then look at the impact, and then we're going to look at the impact of this contrast in fracturing on landscape scale erodibility with a focus on hill slopes. Okay. So to do this, we collected imagery of cliff faces using structure from motion photogrammetry. So this is a picture of Al with a telephoto lens on a camera, and we walked down ridge lines in both of these landscapes with the goal of taking pictures of cliffs across the valley from different angles. You know, sometimes up to 1 kilometer away, but with a telephoto lens, you can get down to resolutions of 1 centimeter or so. So we target a cliff face. We could take those pictures from the different camera stations that are tagged with GPS, and we could reconstruct those into a 3D model using structure from motion photogrammetry. And we could align the models with airborne LiDAR data sets that we have, and then take those models and produce orthophotos normal to the cliff faces at about 1 to 2 centimeter resolution. And then from these cliff photos, Al mapped out the fracture traces on all the visible fractures, and we did this for a number of different cliffs in each landscape. So just an example of a subset of one of these from a single cliff. We expanded this to about 50 cliffs, 20 or so from each landscape in the San Gabriel and San Jacinto Mountains. And what we found was that the bedrock cliffs in the eastern San Gabriel Mountains are about 4 to 5 times more fractured than the northern San Jacinto Mountains. So you could think about this in terms of fracture density, as shown on the left here, or you could also think about it in terms of the median block size that might be produced from the intersection of these fractures. So the contrast here, right, is about a factor of 4 to 5. So now we take this contrast in fracture density and ask, you know, what are the consequences of this for the bare bedrock hill slope morphology? What is the consequence for the transition from soil to bare bedrock hill slopes? The relationship between erosion rate and hill slope morphology, and then the sediment grain size delivered to channels, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I encourage you to look at a paper we just had published in JGR last year for lots more details on that story. Okay, so the first piece of this, we wanted to look at how the cliff morphology varies as a function of fracture density. And so to characterize the morphology of bedrock cliffs, we use the LiDAR point clouds to reconstruct how the slope of cliffs varies or how the relief of cliffs varies as a function of slope. And you can think of this as a way of quantifying, for each slope, what's the steepest or what's the maximum amount of relief that you can support for a given slope on an individual cliff. So we extracted the LiDAR point clouds for each cliff, and then went through every combination of points within that cliff and calculated the local relief as the difference between elevations of those points, and then calculated the slope between those points sort of projected in the vertical. And so if we do this for all combinations of points within an individual cliff, we can define an envelope that defines the maximum relief as a function of for a given slope. The way I'm going to show a bunch of these curves in the next slide, and the way to think about this is like the intercept on the right side here at 90 degrees corresponds to the tallest vertical face that's supported in that cliff. And then as you relax that slope, you can imagine that as you relax the slope, you can support a larger and larger cliff, or there's a larger and larger relief on that cliff, up until the point where you reach the total cliff height here. So we did this for a number of cliffs in each of these landscapes. So we picked out kind of the tallest and steepest cliffs to try to find cliffs that were near their threshold for stability. And what we found is that the cliffs in the northern San Jacinto Mountains can support 2 to 3 times higher relief for a given slope. So this is the cliffs in red here from the San Jacinto Mountains and the blue from the San Gabriel Mountains. And so, one thing I just want to highlight here is that the contrast in relief on these cliffs, it looks sort of, it's a factor of 2 to 3 difference, but the difference is, we're talking about maybe 100 to 200 meters of relief in landscapes that have 2 to 3 kilometers of relief. So for the whole sort of relief budget of the mountain range, this is a minor component. But there's a strong signature of the fracture density contrast in the morphology of these cliffs. We also wanted to compare to a prediction from a Coleman limit equilibrium slope stability model. So this is a sort of simple model for slope stability that predicts a relationship between the relief and slope for a given cliff. And if we fix the friction angle at around 35 degrees, and then we can plot contours of an effective cohesion here in kilopascals. And so you get sort of the same answer in terms of the effective cohesion is about a factor of 2 to 3 higher in the San Jacinto Mountains. Okay, so the cliffs are steeper and taller in the places where we have lower fracture density. The next step we wanted to look at was the partitioning of the bare bedrock and soil-mantled slopes in these patchy landscapes. To do that, we mapped the soil and rock cover using high resolution air photos where we had them. Where we didn't have them, in some places we could go out with drones and collect our own imagery and map directly the areas of exposed rock in the landscape. And then we could combine that with LiDAR derived slope map and allow us to isolate the soil mantled and bedrock components of the landscape to analyze their morphology independently. So this is the results of that mapping from the 2 landscapes. And there's 3 sort of panels on the bottom here that highlight on the y-axis the percent of bedrock exposed on hill slopes going from 0 to 100%. And then as on the x-axis are shown as a function of the catchment mean slope. So each one of these points corresponds to a watershed sort of around 1 to 3 square kilometers. And then on the middle panel is shown elevation. And you can think of this as like a proxy for the mean annual temperature. And then on the right panel is mean annual precipitation. And the thing I want to draw your attention to here is that the first thing is that most of these landscapes are patchy. So there's very few areas that have we don't approach sort of 100% bedrock landscapes except for a very few isolated spots in these places. The transition from sort of predominantly soil mantled to systematic onset of bedrock exposure with increasing slope happens at around the same slope for both of these landscapes, around 35 degrees. And we think that this is related to the soil properties being fairly similar in terms of the stability of the soils. These are, fairly cohesionless soils in this semi-arid landscape. And we think that this doesn't change too much between the two landscapes. The other thing is that the transition from soil to rock is really set by the slope of the landscape. And I'll show in the next couple slides that this is related to the erosion rate. And the bedrock exposure is not set by, there's no systematic variation as a function of climate, right? So the conceptual framework here is really that, the switch from soil to rock is happening because you're steeping in the landscape and exceeding the stability for the soil to stick around. We wanted to quantify the erosion rates in these landscapes, and we used beryllium-10 in sediment to do this. So beryllium-10 is produced in quartz grains in the near surface, and the concentration varies inversely with erosion rate. And what we can do then is go to an outlet of a watershed and collect sediment samples and amalgamate the hill slope exposure histories of all those grains and give us a catchment average erosion rate. And we're using this method in small, steep headwater catchments. And I'll just want to highlight that this is not typically done because of worries about landslide impacts on mixing or extracting undosed material from depth and influencing those erosion rates. And it turns out, so in sort of a separate study, so this is something I presented on at AGU this year, and is sort of in prep, but is a compilation of a bunch of erosion rates from the San Gabriel Mountains, where we can combine the erosion rate analysis with now sort of detailed mapping of deep-seated landslides, and show that when you pick sites that are not affected by deep-seated landslides, you can see this in the LiDAR data itself, that you can actually get robust erosion rates down to small drainage areas of even less than a square kilometer. And so we think that the erosion rates in this landscape, the catchment average rates, are really holding up even in steep parts of the landscape and reflecting, you can think of it as a proxy almost for the soil production rate. And I can talk more about that in detail if you have questions later. And so what we can do then is we can take those watersheds where we've measured catchment average erosion rate. So each one of these points on the plot here is a headwater watershed that we've measured erosion rate and mapped the bedrock exposure. And you can see there's a systematic increase in bedrock exposure with erosion rate for both of these landscapes. And the onset of that systematic bedrock exposure, you can think of this as indicating a limit to the soil production rate or an efficiency of the soil production in these landscapes. And these two landscapes are shifted, and you can think about this in a framework where, for example, the San Gabriel Mountains in blue here, because the bedrock has higher fracture density, it's easier to convert rock to soil for a given soil thickness. And this leads to lower overall bedrock exposure in the landscape because you can break down the rock before it makes it to the surface. We can look at this in a more regional context or global context and start thinking about this sort of phase space of erosion rate on the x-axis and the bedrock exposed on the y-axis as a way of thinking about how soil production efficiency varies across landscapes. So I've added two other data sets here on this chart. So the gray triangles here are from the New Zealand Southern Alps. So this is Isaac Larson's work, where he showed that some of the highest soil production rates observed anywhere globally. And the consequence of that is that the high soil production rates allows you to sustain soil mantled landscapes up to, you know, a meter to or millimeter per year or two. And this is, we think this is a consequence of differences in either the climate. So New Zealand's a lot wetter than the San Gabriel Mountains, and perhaps differences in lithology. As a sort of another end member, we can also look at data from the Sierra Nevada. So this is a compilation of a few different studies throughout the Sierra Nevada, and the relationship between bedrock exposure and erosion rate here is actually, it's definitely not positive. It's either non-existent or maybe even slightly inverted or negative, and this is thought to reflect this idea that maybe the controls on soil production in these landscapes are more related to variations in the mineralogy that ties into nutrient availability for vegetation and sort of biotic controls on soil production. And so, in this case, the soil production certainly compared to, the landscapes we're looking at in the San Gabriel Mountains is lower soil production rates, and this leads to higher bedrock exposure, low erosion rates. Okay. So now we can go and take a look at erosion rate and hill slope morphology in these landscapes. And I'm showing now data where each one of these points corresponds to a watershed where we have erosion rates and mapped bedrock and soil exposure. And on the x-axis is erosion rate, on the y-axis is the catchment mean hill slope angle. And so, this you can see just on first cut that for the same topography in the San Gabriel Mountains, the erosion rates are 2 to 5 times higher than the San Jacinto Mountains. And so, I think the question here is, how do we interpret this sort of offset in the relationship between topography and erosion rate in landscapes that have a patchy soil and bedrock cover? And so I mentioned before that around 35 degrees for catchment averaged hill slope angle determines the switch from soil mantled to patchy hill slopes or patchy soil and bedrock. And we see the erosion rates continuing to be sensitive with slope much beyond that, up to almost 45 or 46 degrees hill slope angle, which is sort of different than the typical assumptions we have about connections between hill slope morphology and erosion rate. So we wanted to dig into this a little bit more. And the way we did this was we took the bedrock mapping that we did for each of these watersheds, and we separated out the soil mantled and bedrock hill slope morphologies. So you can think about this conceptually as if this is a distribution of hill slope angles, the total morphology of the total distribution of hill slope angles within the landscape is the sum of a soil mantled fraction and a bedrock fraction. And so what we're doing is separating these two out for each watershed. So some of them are totally soil mantled, so they don't have a bedrock component. But others, you can see there's a split between the bedrock hill slopes that are steeper and the soil mantled hill slopes that have a limit that they approach because of the stability of the soils. So what we did then is we took the soil mantled components of each of these watersheds and we treated the morphology of the soil mantled component as if it was a steady state soil mantled hill slope. So there's a little bit of a jump that needs to be made there, but we can think about the connection between slope and erosion rate for the soil mantled parts of the landscape in the context of some of those soil transport laws that I briefly showed at the beginning of the talk. And what I want to highlight here is that the soil mantled slopes generally agree with predictions from these soil transport relationships. And if we assume that the critical slope is similar for both of these landscapes, as suggested by the transition from soil to bedrock being similar, the K that you get, or the transport coefficient for this relationship, is 2 to 3 times lower in the San Jacinto Mountains. And we think this is related to the coarser armor on these hill slopes that can be observed because of the lower fracture density. So the lower fracture density leads to coarser sediment armoring the hill slopes, and that makes it harder to transport soil for a given slope. We can also look and compare this to the critical slopes that we get for the bedrock components of the landscapes that's pulled from the analysis of the bedrock cliff morphologies. And what I want to highlight here is that there's the difference between the critical slope for bedrock in the San Jacinto Mountains is greater than the difference between the critical bedrock slope and the critical soil slope in the San Gabriel Mountains. And so there's a wider range of stable bedrock hill slope morphologies in the places where the bedrock is stronger. And what this means for the San Gabriel Mountains is that when bedrock sort of pokes through the surface and gets exposed at the surface, it's already pretty close to the limit of the failure for the fractured rock. And what this allows a relatively tight relationship between morphology and erosion rate to extend to much higher erosion rates and much steeper slopes. So I can go more into that in questions if people have it, but there's interesting consequences here for what happens when you expose rock on hill slopes, and then let's say you turn off channel incision or rock uplift rate, how that landscape responds following sort of in a waning relief setting. Okay, so the implications for patchy hill slope dynamics here. So going back to the sort of initial question of how we think about the evolution of mixed soil and bedrock hill slopes. I think, one thing I hope I convince you that because the soil and rock have different strengths, we can't just treat these landscapes with a single threshold to describe their dynamics. So a lot of times hill slope evolution for steep landscapes assumes either a threshold for the soil or a threshold for the rock. And we need to account for both of those in the transition from soil to rock to understand the behavior of these landscapes. We looked at the impact of fracture density on three key aspects of this system. The fracture density controls the soil production efficiency and thus the extent of bedrock that's exposed on hill slopes. It controls the strength of the bedrock cliffs, which influences hill slope relief and landscape stability. And then it also influences the size of coarse sediment mantling hill slopes, which impacts the soil transport efficiency. So there's all these, to really sort of model the behavior of mixed soil and bedrock slopes, we need to understand, right, the soil production, the soil transport, and then also the stability of rock and soil. Okay, so I'm gonna shift gears now for the second part of the talk and switch to talking about post-wildfire debris flows in Southern California. So this is the same landscape that we've been talking about before in the San Gabriel Mountains, and just to highlight the images I'm going to be showing on the right panel here are actually the exact same region as the opening image, so you could see the mountain front is the same in both images. And I'm going to be looking at how sediment yield increases following wildfire in these landscapes. So this is a pretty well-known observable going back along, pretty much since people have been living in Southern California. There's been fires and post-fire debris flows. And we've been able to observe this going back to the 1920s and 30s with some of the earliest air photos in the US at least. And this is a before and after of this event in 1934 called the New Year's flood that came following a fire in the previous fall. And you can see, I'll switch back and forth. And this, at this time, the debris flows that came out following this fire were the result of a big storm that hit the landscape and produced debris flows that spilled out, kilometers from the mountain front on these fans. And these fans now are developed, right? So it's a big worry of how we think about, what the future hazards for post-fire debris flows are in a warming climate where fire frequency is expected to increase. Right now you can see actually the debris basins. So these are sort of catch basins that collect sediment coming out of the San Gabriel Mountains. And we want to know, like, which of these, how do we build these? How do we clear them out? Where do we need to be worried following a fire for inundating the houses on these fans? The challenge here is that the mechanisms for post-fire spikes in sediment yield and these debris flows is unclear, and especially so in mixed soil and bedrock landscapes. So this, getting back to the sort of first half of the talk, we're talking about this patchwork of soil and rock. Now we're going to look at how this patchwork of soil and rock impacts the short-term response to wildfire. So if we want to think about debris flow hazards in these landscapes, ultimately it depends on how sediment is delivered from hill slopes into the channels. And there's two kind of end member ways that this is typically thought of. On the top, I'm showing a sort of infographic from the Washington Post that shows, one way is you can think of as like a wet process, where the fire influences the hill slope hydrology such that runoff increases and you have increased overland flow and erosion through rilling and things like that can move sediment off of the hill slopes. And that's in contrast to the dry response that's shown in the bottom panels here, where following fire on steep landscapes, if the slopes are steeper than the angle of repose, when you burn vegetation, that sediment can be mobilized without any rainfall at all and make it down to the stream channels and add sediment to the channels that then can be mobilized during subsequent storms. And so I have a couple of examples here from the San Gabriel Mountains that highlight this contrast of sort of wet versus dry sediment transport from hill slopes to channels. On the left is showing rills that formed on a soil-mantled hill slope following a storm after the 2009 station fire. On the right is showing a channel that's been filled in with dry ravel fine grained sediment following a fire, the Colby fire in 2014. And what you can see here is that the hill slopes have been stripped down to bedrock, and all of the sediment that was formerly on the hill slopes is now filled in to the channel bottoms as these cones of dry sediment. And then if you look at after the sort of first big rainfall event in this landscape, all of that fine-grained sediment was cleared out in a debris flow, and the landscape scoured, the channels scoured down to bedrock. And there's a backpack there for scale. So these are two very different mechanisms, and they have implications for how we predict post-fire hazards, how we think about changing hazards with time and sort of limitations, sediment supply limitations on hill slopes. But there's a question of how we actually measure and predict which of these dominate in the landscape that is a patchwork of soil and bare bedrock. So I'm going to look at this using an example from the 2009 station fire in San Gabriel Mountains, where there was 650 square kilometers of the landscape that burned. And following this fire, there were high sediment yields in the form of debris flows that filled up debris basins like this one on the right, and in some cases overtopped them and inundated houses like here on the left. And we have records of how much sediment came out for a number of small watersheds along the range front where we have debris basins that measure the amount of sediment yield just from the year or two after the storm of about, a couple centimeters to maybe 10 centimeters distributed over the whole watershed. So high rates of erosion here. So we took advantage of LiDAR data sets that were collected at various times bracketing this fire. And so I was part of an effort to collect a post-fire data set in 2009, right after the fire, but before any rainfall hit. So it turns out that this window is really important for capturing that dry ravel signature in the landscape. We have a small sort of 15 square kilometer area that just happened to have LiDAR that was collected by the USGS in the summer of 2009 before the fire. And then there were 2 really wet years in 2010 and 2011, and then followed by a big drought. And then in 2015, 2016, there was additional LiDAR collected over all of Los Angeles County as part of the 3DEP project, the USGS 3DEP project. And so we have 3 data sets of LiDAR in a small patch of the landscape, and then we have the post-fire and post-rainfall LiDAR over a much larger area. So I want to zoom in and show sort of what we can see in terms of landscape change with these temporal sequence of LiDAR data sets. And so we're going to zoom into an area that had all 3 data sets. And this is, I'm going to show a series of perspective slope maps. So this is the pre-fire LiDAR data, and I'm going to show a cross section here, A to A prime, that will stay the same for the next few slides. I'll quickly just jump to put this in context. So if we take this A to A prime, we're looking at a small watershed that went from being sort of this patchy soil with maybe a little bit of bedrock poking through to being predominantly bare bedrock. So we stripped all of the soil off of the hill slopes and it filled in the channels. And you can see that after the rainfall, so this imagery was taken from 2 years of winters following the fire, you can actually see the aggradation in the channel network behind check dams of all that sediment that came off the hillsides and then was mobilized as debris flows. So we'll go back to this image, and I'm going to show a time series here of 3 time slices. And so I'll flip back and forth so that you can sort of see the difference. But what we're showing, this is the before to after the fire. And this is highlighting up to about 2 to 3 meters of dry ravel accumulation in the headwater valleys. And this is that, just for context, this type of process where we're filling in the channels with sediment through dry processes without any assistance from rainfall. And we can quantify that in map view as well. And then in the 2015 data, all of that material is stripped out, right? So we scour out all of that material that accumulated in those valley bottoms. And you can see the values of the scour are actually greater than the value of accumulation. So not only you're removing the dry sediment that filled in the channels, but you're eroding down into the underlying channel deposits or maybe bedrock in places. So we can take this and we can upscale this, across the whole landscape using the LiDAR point clouds and to calculate the difference between these 2 time slices, the post-fire and post-rainfall, and map out at sort of the scale of small headwater catchments, the net post-fire erosion. So what I'm showing here is the area of overlap where we have the post-fire LiDAR and the 2015 post-rainfall LiDAR. And their watersheds are colorized by the catchment mean erosion that happened following fire. And then you can see along the range front here, it's a little hard to see, but there's yellow outlines for the debris basins that I mentioned earlier in this section. And the LiDAR differencing captures about 30% of the flux that is measured by the debris basins. There's a strong correlation between those 2. And the other thing I want to highlight is that the pattern of erosion is not sort of evenly distributed across the burn area. So everywhere this red boundary corresponds to the burn area. So everywhere in the north half of this image was burned. It's all steep, but there was a very different response north and south of the South San Gabriel fault zone. This that defines this fault block on the southwest here. So we wanted to look at this in a little bit of a different way. So this is plotting slope versus burn severity as measured from repeat satellite imagery. For each one of these dots corresponds to one of those watersheds, and it's colorized by the catchment erosion. And what I want to highlight here is that although you kind of need to have steep slopes to have debris flows, and the landscape needs to have burned, there's no clear connection between slope, burn severity, and erosion, as might be expected with most current models for post-fire debris flows. We tried to, if we zoom in on one of these areas, we compare two spots that had a very different response in terms of erosion, post-fire erosion. One landscape that, both these landscapes had the same burn intensity, same slopes, generally the same rock types. They're both crystalline rocks. And the one landscape had basically no response, and the other, every single tributary filled in with dry gravel and then scoured in a debris flow. And so we tried to plug these observations, these landscapes, into a model that we've been developing for storage of dry gravel on hill slopes and the transport of that material following a fire. And it turns out that the model is unable to capture this difference. So something's missing here. And so, if we look at the data in a slightly different way, now if we separate out just the bedrock geology that's exposed north of the South San Gabriel fault zone and south of the South San Gabriel fault zone, now we see that the lithology appears to be the dominant control on whether or not these landscapes experienced post-fire debris flows. And more than that, whether they experienced the dry gravel loading and then the post-fire debris flows. The reasons for this are we still don't have a really clean explanation. And so the first thing to highlight is that these debris flows occur where the dry gravel accumulates. So the places that have no response in terms of the debris flows, it's not like they, had the channels load up with dry gravel and then a storm didn't hit them. It's that they never loaded with dry gravel in the first place. And so if you look at the rocks that are exposed, there's subtle differences in terms of the rocks in this block appear kind of more junky in the outcrops. Is this related to the mineralogy, the deformation history, something to do with the fracturing? The lithology appears to be really important, but we don't have a good explanation for why yet. So this is something I'm still working on. We're using some of the fires from this fall to help dig into this in more detail. But I guess the take home from this is that even though we don't have a full understanding of sort of how these mixed bedrock and soil landscapes are responding to fire, the post-fire loading in these landscapes is resolvable with repeat airborne LiDAR. And so now, because so much of this landscape, basically everywhere in Southern California has LiDAR now, following fire, there's the potential we can go out and collect data right after the fire, but before the rains, to map out where this sediment accumulation in the valleys is happening as a proxy for debris flow hazard. Okay, so I guess the take-home points from this is that when you have sort of a patchwork of soil and rock in landscapes, so when landscapes are a mix of soil and bare bedrock, this provides it first provides a window into understanding how rock strength controls hill slope erodibility. Because these different parts of the system are so sensitive to the lithology. And so this allows us to it requires us to understand things like what controls soil production efficiency and the partitioning of soil and rock. The lithology controls the bare bedrock morphology, and then might indirectly control the soil transport through the effective hill slope sediment size. And then when we try to go to landscapes that are a mix of soil and rock, try to predict their behavior following fire, it appears that in the San Gabriel Mountains, at least, that dry ravel is the primary control in these landscapes for facilitating post-fire debris flows. We see that this is insensitive to slope and burn intensity to the first order, and the lithologic differences matter a lot. And so we're still trying to work out, to make our models better, to figure out how to incorporate those components into this prediction. But since we can resolve that signature, as sort of an exciting thing to be able to get a window into that. And so, yeah, so I guess the take home here is that both of these examples highlight the importance of untangling these lithologic controls on hill slope processes if we want to understand steep landscapes. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Roman. It was really great. Really nice talk on cool data. So now the chat is open. I already see some questions popping up. I also just remind people that join during the talk that if you want to ask questions, so you can write them into the chat, or you can raise your hand. There is a small button called with a little smiley, and then you can click on it. And then we will unmute yourself if you want to directly ask your question to Roman. So Steffi or Boris, if you want to take the first question.
Okay, I'm going to start then. Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk, also from my side. The first question that came in is from Miles Reed. What could be the importance of saprolite in the first story, in a larger sense beyond the two landscapes shown?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I think, one of the things that in these landscapes, the rock that is, if you were to go dig a soil pit in some of these steep landscapes, you're going to hit fractured rock that doesn't really seem like a saprolite. But in both landscapes, what happens is you go to lower erosion rates. So there's spatial patterns in the erosion rates in both the San Gabriels and San Jacintos. And as you go to the landscapes where there's a saprolite or weathered bedrock, what ends up happening is that the role of the fractures starts to be less important than the sort of grain boundaries of the rock itself. And so what you see is that the sediment that gets produced, sort of gets homogenized. And so you actually see on the low relief parts of both of these landscapes that instead of the sediment being, related to the fractures, it's related to the sort of grain boundaries. So, that's something that it's a lot harder to measure, because you don't have the rocks exposed at the surface. But I suspect that in places where you have enough time for rock to sit around and weather in the subsurface, that becomes more important. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for the talk as well. So the next question is from Suzanne Conway. And the question is, how long does it take for dry gravel to accumulate to such a degree to generate debris flows? If there was a rain straight after the fire, would there be still debris flows?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It happens basically immediately. So, firefighters in Southern California, oftentimes have to clear the dry ravel off of the roads. So you can imagine if there's a break in slope that you have, those are also natural spots for dry ravel to accumulate. And so the fire roads that these firefighters are driving on to fight during the fire, right? Those get blocked by these cones of dry ravel. So this is an instantaneous process. And then but there's also a follow-up. So if you go to these landscapes afterwards, and you just listen, you can hear the landscape unraveling. And so there's an initial pulse, and then there's probably some, additional disturbance from wind and animals and things like that is a slow trickle following the fire.
So there's the next question by Violeta Tolosa, who is saying thanks a lot for the great talk. And she's asking, what about the frequency of past wildfires? I think it's a tricky one.
So when we went into this project, we initially thought that that was going to be a really key player in terms of allowing time for those sediment stores to build up between fires. And, you know, the observations, you know, that was kind of the first thing we thought of when we saw this contrast in the response. And it turns out that the frequency that, you know, both the number of you can think of it as like the number of fires, at least since the late 1800s when we have good records, or the time since the last fire, that doesn't, you know, that's pretty similar for a lot of these areas. It doesn't, there's no correlation between, we've measured both of those, and there's no systematic variations that explain sort of the high contrast in response. You know, I think it should matter. My sense is that the timing between fires has been generally long enough in the past that it's not a rate limiting step. If you were to go back out and burn the landscape right away, again, the next year, you know, maybe it would be a limitation, but then you also don't have anything to burn. So there's a sort of time scale for the vegetation to grow back that might be coupled also with sort of actually producing new sediment and filling up those stores. But we don't, that's a part of the story we don't have a good handle on yet.
Okay, so the next question or comment is from Todd Ehlers, and it just says a question about rock uplift rates. So I guess it relates to the first part of the story or of your presentation, probably asking if you could say something about the uplift rates of the two regions and maybe if they differ. So
yeah.
If that is not the question, maybe you can rephrase your question, Todd.
I guess, you know, what I can say about that is that, you know, we're assuming that the erosion, we're using erosion rates as sort of a proxy for this, and assuming that the morphology of the hill slopes that we're looking at don't show sort of clear evidence for a detachment of the hill slopes from what's going on down below in the river channels. So you don't see, you know, no sort of systematic nick points and things like that. The evidence, so sort of independent evidence for rock uplift rates, I guess, you know, we have, you can look at longer term exhumation from the thermochron data. So there is low temperature thermochron data. It's not very helpful because it's so old. So it doesn't really record the recent uplift history. But the data are older, they're older helium ages in the San Jacinto Mountains, for example. The other piece of it is the expression of faulting along the range front. So in the San Gabriel Mountains, the eastern San Gabriel Mountains, you know, you have offset fan surfaces and slip rates on the faults that are on the order of 0.5 meter to millimeter, or 0.5 millimeter to millimeter per year. And you have, you know, there's lots of seismicity in that part of the San Andreas fault and the Cucamonga thrust fault. In the San Jacinto Mountains, you know, the fans that are against the range front are all sort of backfilled. There's no active faulting right at the range front boundary. And we think of the San Jacinto Mountains and that area as being sort of a relatively coherent block that's been exhumed rather than sort of a deforming, you know, corner of a mountain range. So, you know, it's likely there's a connection there between the fracturing and the mode of uplift, but we don't have a clean story for that yet.
So the next comment is from Michael Singer, who first thank you for the very nice talk. I'm wondering, based on this framework, whether there is any hope of being able to reconstruct the history of fire and extreme rainfall based only on bedrock, slope, and relief characteristics that you discussed, perhaps through a model?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, you know, one of the challenges that I've been sort of trying to deal with is like, how do you connect these two timescales? And how do you, you know, we looked in, we focused our analysis in the eastern San Gabriel Mountains on landscapes that hadn't burned in, you know, 10, 15 years or so. But there's only a limit, you know, all of Southern California is impacted by fires. And so it's sort of, intertwined in some ways, the role of fires and then the role of debris flows in scouring out these landscapes. I don't know if there's a good test that allows us to extract, for example, how we can do it through a model, for example, like having the connect, if you need, say, the fine sediment in the channels to initiate the debris flows, and then those debris flows are what then scours bedrock in the headwaters. That's one way to do it. I don't quite know how you test that in the field, though. That's the only challenge. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the modeling realm, but how you actually connect that with sort of independent field evidence, I think is going to be tough.
Okay, the next question is from Emma Lod, who is also saying thank you for a really interesting talk. And she's curious about the soil production efficiency in the first part of the talk. How exactly does mantling of blocks on hill slopes lower the soil production efficiency? Is it because precipitation can't reach the soil, or because it is physically blocked by the blocks, or something else?
Yeah, so the soil production efficiency, I think, is more related to the fractures themselves. So rather than the blocks that are sitting on top of the slope, it's more that the underlying bedrock, it's harder to detach, to convert rock to soil when you have wider fracture spacing. And so I think the blocks on the top are more related to how efficiently you can move the soil mantle for a given slope. And so that, could be related to overland flow. It could be related to, the disturbance energy from trees or animals or something being harder to move, coarser sediment that's armoring the surface. But yeah, the soil production, we think, is more related to the underlying bedrock.
Okay, so the next question, there's quite some more to come. The next one is from Anne-Laure Argentine, who also thanks you for the nice talk. You measured joint density. Could you measure also joint orientation using structure for motion?
Yes, we tried it. It's easier to do when the fracture spacing is wide, but even then it's time consuming. And so the data is, we have all these models up on open topography. So you can go and actually look at the 3D models, and they're all georeferenced to LiDAR. So the orientations are extractable. We just haven't done it. So it's much trickier in the San Gabriel Mountains because the resolution of the 3D exposure is down near the fracture spacing. And so it becomes much harder to find kind of those joint orientations or to constrain them in 3D. But it's definitely was something that was kind of on our list to do, and just didn't, just haven't done it. But yeah, it'd be great to do that.
The next question is from Kirk Townsend. Was there a difference in the observed distribution of post-wildfire debris flows north and south of the South San Gabriel Fault? Are wet processes like drilling contributing enough sediment to generate debris flows north to the fault zone?
Yeah, so I think that we actually were picking up the lack of debris flows. So if there were debris flows north of the fault zone, we would have seen them in the LiDAR difference between the 2015 data and the immediate post-fire data. And so, there might be there might be some sediment moving through that system, but I would say we don't see any evidence for debris flows that were, either eroding or depositing sediment to, more than our resolution of is around like 30 to 50 centimeters in terms of what can get picked up with the repeat LiDAR. And there's no evidence for that. And also I'll just, add, we did see, so having walked around those landscapes right after the fire, like we had set up some, this is with Kellen Whipple and a few other folks when I was at Arizona State, we had thought, right after that fire, we're going to go do some terrestrial laser scans of some of these small watersheds and, look for and map out that post-fire response over the next couple of years. and we picked a few small watersheds north of the sand of that fault zone. The USGS did the same thing, Jason Keene and others, but on the south side, and they got a bunch of debris flows, and we just got, you know, grasses growing back in, and nothing happened, right? So it's I think there's other observations that we saw. There was definitely rilling on the hill slopes, but that didn't lead to the initiation of the big debris flows in the channels themselves.
Okay, the next question is from Mong Huan Wang, asking for the first part of the talk. So if the delta G between the two mountain belts is similar, what controls the bedrock fracture density? And also they seem to be close to a series of active faults. Would the nearby active fault activity on heterogeneous uplift can influence erosion fracture density? I think it's also linked to the question of Todd.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a good question. We think the mode of uplift and deformation history is probably influencing the fractures. So, I mean, the eastern San Gabriel Mountains are just riddled with faults, you know, beyond just the range bounding fault. You walk in and you see faults all over the place in outcrop. And that's this big contrast from the San Jacinto Mountains. And the same goes for seismicity in terms of there's very little seismicity in the sort of core of the San Jacinto Mountains. And so I think it's probably related to that. We don't really have a good kind of mechanistic reason beyond that to explain the contrast in fracture density, but it'd be great to follow up on.
Yeah, the next question was a private or anonymous question. It is interesting to see that the soil transport efficiency K of the San Gabriel Mountains is more than twice as high as of the San Jacinto Mountains. In that plot, how did you get the catchment-wide erosion rates exclusively for bedrock hill slopes?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So we were making the assumption that the catchment erosion rates are reflecting that the erosion rates are uniform throughout the catchment, right? So that's sort of the fundamental assumption there. And, you know, there's a hint that that's the case because so first off, we looked at different grain sizes. So thinking that the erosion rates from the coarse sediment might be more reflective of the bedrock exposures and the fine sediment from the soil-mantled parts of the landscape, and we didn't see systematic variations in the nuclei concentrations. For a couple, we didn't do this, we took just a couple samples for that. The other piece of evidence that we have is that in the San Gabriel Mountains, this is from a paper with Arjun Heimsath in 2012, we measured soil production rates that were, you know, basically able to keep up with the catchment erosion rates throughout the full range that we measured them. And so we think that the soil mantle parts of the hill slopes, the soil production rates are able to keep up. You know, there's no reason to think that there should be a limit to that. And so we're using that as our erosion rate. You know, to the degree that that's, you know, accurate, it's kind of a hard thing to test, I think, in sort of very directly to measure the erosion rates in the bedrock, on the bedrock exposure particularly.
Can I quickly ask an intermediate question here, because it relates to that? So in those deep catchments, you showed lots of erosion rates that you measured. So most of the data was probably on sand or silt size, but then you did also measure pebbles in the river, and they didn't show any difference to the sand?
Correct. So we, in one catchment from each, the San Gabriel and San Jacinto Mountains, we took an amalgamation of like pea gravel size, and then also like some cobbles that we crushed and amalgamated like 100 cobbles or something together. And so there's no systematic differences. So there's differences between them, but they're not like all of the cobbles have lower concentration than all of the sand.
Okay, thanks.
There are still quite a lot of questions to go through. So the next question is from Uday, who first thank you for the very interesting talk. Will different lithology have different slope angles of transition from soil to rock? How much could it vary from a hard rock terrain versus a sedimentary terrain, for example?
Yeah, so I think this is the transition from soil to rock, we think is reflecting the stability of the soils themselves. So you can imagine that there's a, you know, that might depend on lithology. Let's say like clay content or something could influence the strength of the soils, or, you know, or the vegetation, right, could add cohesion to the soils. So I think the effects of lithology are primarily indirect through that. And maybe also climate is going to be important for controlling that.
Okay, the next question from Ayn Voklander, who is also saying thank you, a nice talk. And she's asking the question, can you comment on whether the topography and so the steepness of your hill slopes is in your view a response or a cause for the processes, so weathering denudation that you see? And if it is a cause, where did it come from?
Yeah, I guess that's sort of a chicken and the egg question. It's, I mean, at some level, the landscapes have to be uplifted first, and so the topography is a response in that sense. I don't know how, like, I guess, I mean, but it also has to be a cause because the topography was what's driving the processes today. So I don't know. I don't know how to, like, I'm not quite sure how to unpack that other than to, you know, the way, I guess the way we've thought about this is like starting from the current state, how do you, like, moving forward, sort of how do you sustain or you know, or erase the topography. And that I started to get into that a little bit about the contrast between the rock strength and the soil strength as controlling like a window of stability for the bedrock once it pokes through the landscape. And so I think maybe part of the answer is in there, that there's a that you can have like a pulse of erosion or uplift or something that kicks you into the bedrock, you know, exposure. And then if the bedrock is really strong, you can sort of be forced to stick there, and sort of take a long time to decay away then the cliff faces that emerge. But if the rock is fractured and sort of not that different in its stability than the soil, it's maybe easier to transition back and forth from sort of soil mantled to rocky. And we actually see this in the San Gabriel Mountains following fire. The examples from the station fire that were places where, you know, you were just bare rock after the fire. You know, you could see soil before the fire, bare rock right after the fire, and then 10 years later, they're soil mantled again. And so there's, you know, but I think that's reflecting the fact that the rock, you know, is, you know, just underneath the surface and is also not very strong. So it's easy to convert it back to soil. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a tough question.
But it answers partly the next question already, which was another private question asking, in Southern California, where wildfires and debris flows are somehow frequent, is the bedrock exposure area a highly variable quantity that changes a lot through time? Yeah, so I mean, I think it's, you know, you can imagine there's like areas of persistent bedrock that are always bedrock, and there's areas that are always soil. And then there's areas that are sensitive, that are right at that boundary, that are basically can, you know, a fire is enough to strip them down to bedrock, but then the rates are fast enough that they can basically, on revegetating, can accumulate a thin soil mantle again.
So Todd Ellis actually detailed a bit his former questions. So the question was about how do you separate rock uplift difference versus fracture difference in the first part of your talk. So he's referring to the top right figure of your final slide.
Yeah, I guess so in one sense, that's by measuring the erosion rates, I guess and by picking areas where we're just making the assumption that the erosion rates are a proxy for the rock uplift rates. And that the fracture differences, you know, are controlling what that relationship looks like. So I don't know. I guess I don't know whether or not you could isolate the rock uplift difference beyond making that assumption, at least over the timescales that are kind of important for connecting to the modern topography and processes.
Okay, the next question from Toby Minera. So for the station fire, how much of the spatial sediment response was due to varying precipitation? Do you have good spatial precipitation data there?
Yeah, so there's some precipitation data. So there's there's pretty decent precipitation along the front range, and there's precipitation data at a few spots in the interior. For the most part, those landscapes were responding to the same storms, so north and south of the South San Gabriel Fault. And I guess the key thing that makes me think it's not related to precipitation variation is that is the absence of the dry ravel deposits in the northern part of the landscape. So the areas where we didn't see the scour by debris flows, it's not like you just filled in the channels with dry sediment and then it sat there because it didn't get rained on. You can actually go and look at those landscapes, and there's absolutely no evidence for any dry ravel sticking around. So it's that they never loaded in the first place. And so, even though you might have spatial variations in rain that control the specific timing, because we're integrating over 5 years, I think all of those places would have had opportunities for sort of rainfall to scour out those deposits.
Okay, the next question is by Dan Parsons about the priming and triggering of flow events, and in particular, how the flow events and their sizes and magnitudes are controlled by rates of priming, like sediment production, versus the broadband array of triggers and their timescales.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in some ways, like, you still need to have rainfall to drive the debris flows, right? So I think this year is maybe a good example of that, of the fact that there was a bunch of fires in California, Southern California, in some of this very similar landscapes, and there just haven't been very many storms, and a lot of the storms that have hit have been pretty cold and have dropped snow instead of rain, and so the triggers are actually different. So if you don't have the trigger, it doesn't matter what that production is. So I think that both, if the sediment is still in the channels though, so if you have a storm next year, you're still going to clear out the sediment that accumulated this year. So the timing and the size of the individual events still depends on those, on the hydrology. And in particular, like, the peak flows is going to depend on the hill slope hydrology. And if you wait 2 years, even if you have a bunch of fine sediment in the channel, if you revegetate the hill slopes, the hydrologic response to the same storm is going to be less. So there is, there's the hydrology is still really important. But I think if you're just trying to think of like the total sediment budget for a fire and how the sort of integrated over a few years, all that stuff is going to come out, and that's going to be set by the sediment production and delivery. But the details of sort of how big the storms are, how much volume in an individual debris flow, that's going to be set by the hydrology.
The next question is from Nilesh Jaiswara. I'm really sorry if I mispronounced the name. Who first, thank you for the great talk, and then has a question about interaction with potential glacial processes. I am wondering how the bedrock exposure due to glacial advance and retreat would affect hill slope processes and catchment erosion.
Yeah, so I mean, so these landscapes weren't glaciated, but you can imagine that in a landscape that you do have glaciers come through, that could be a trigger to shift from soil to rock. And the same sort of hysteresis or whatever, if you have a really strong contrast in rock strength and soil strength, that could kick off and sort of lead you into bedrock hill slope land and hard to recover from that. So I imagine you probably see that in a lot of landscapes where glaciers scour down to bedrock, And then the rock is stable because it's, you know, it can support steeper slopes, and it takes enough time. You have to basically erode that bedrock back down to a low enough slope angle that soil can stick on it again. So I imagine the same site, you know, these same types of perturbations apply to that type of landscape.
Okay, there's the final question by Chris Thomas. He's asking about the petrology, or the small-scale petrology of the different lithologies, which are the mode, the degree of mineral alteration, and alteration associated to faults or joints. For example, is there any evidence of greater alteration of the monzogranites and diorites, especially given that the latter will have more unstable mafic phases?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we're definitely planning to do, and a lot of that we've been limited by COVID in terms of travel to do the field work to support this. So, but that's pretty high on the list to go look at particularly the contrast in dry rabble response that we think is sensitive to those mineral, you know, how you basically detach the grain boundaries and produce the fine sediment that can travel down slope. So you know, it's part of the next steps here. But yeah, I totally agree.
I actually would have one last question. It's quick and short, I promise. Have you also looked at the grain size distribution in the rivers in the first part of your talk? So when you kind of touched on this a little bit, that there are different grain sizes produced, but yeah, if you have looked at them in the river, is there any systematic difference between the grain sizes and the related fracturing?
Yes.
Fracturing?
Yes, definitely, and it clearly reflects the contrast in fracture density. So there's a great story there from Al Neely's paper that came out in JGR in last September or something. So I'd point you to that. We have grain size data sort of, you know, fully distributed at the catchment scale for both of these landscapes. And so you can actually track how the sort of sediment changes size from the talus slopes into the headwater channels, down into the river networks and onto the fans, and see how that varies as a function of the fracture density in each landscape, and also the time, the residence time on the hill slopes, where you have grain size reduction on soil weathering. So yeah, there's a really cool story there, and I encourage you to check out that paper.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. I'll do that right now afterwards.
That's actually a last follow-up question from Anne Voigtlander. Do you really need to weather bedrock to a lower slope angle, or can you not simply deposit granular material at the steeper bedrock and thus create a low angle deposit?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So that could, you know, that could happen too. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I think it was a very great and long discussion, many different questions. I just asked the audience, still many people there, if you have a last question for Roman, and if not, I would say thanks to everybody. So the presentation on Roman's talk on question has been recorded and will be put on our website soon. And yeah, if you have any other question, I think it's all good. So I will close now the session, and I will thank you again, Roman. It was really nice, really inspiring talks on many different results. So thanks again.
All right,
everybody. Take care. We will stay there for a few more minutes, but I will say you have a good day, good night, good evening.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.